In part 1, we covered the basics of developing a plugin. In this part 2, we're going to take a look at how to implement request handler as well as the use of templates to be able to use a plugin, in this case an authentication action that will also give some prompt to the end user. Building on the code we had from part 1, I'm going to extend the action descriptor here to implement the get authentication action request handler types method. So this request handler would then return a hash map of my endpoints here. We do have to implement the request handler itself, so I'll just have IntelliJ create that class here, and it implements the action completion request handler interface. With IntelliJ, we can now choose to implement the methods for this interface. The idea of this sample action is that we'll take some values from the configuration and display them to the user when the action executes. And with that, we need to modify the get method here to include a request. Same goes for the post method, and the preprocess method needs to return the request instead of returning null. We want this action to keep track of a state, so with that we need a session manager, and that's actually possible to make available to us through the configuration. So we'll add a get session manager method here. And we'll switch back to the request handler. We're going to add a constructor here. We're going to add some class variables here. We need an intermediate authentication state object, as well as the session manager. And we also need access to the configuration. Now let's initialize these in the constructor. We can get the session manager from the configuration. Now let's implement the get method. This is what gets called by the action, and we can designate in here what template that gets used and rendered as part of the action being triggered. Can statically import this empty map method. Right now we're putting the value of the int parameter. We can also add the string here so that we get two values now rendered by the template. Gotta pick up the string here from the configuration as well. Obviously other values and other things can be done here that's presented to the user. This is a very simple example. What we want to have happen is the myInt and myString values displayed to the user when the action triggers after an authenticator. In order to do that, we need to keep track of the state. So within the action, I'm going to add a static session key that we can look if it's been set or not. Back in the handler here, we will import that session key. Now in our post method, we can use the session manager to put this session key attribute and set it to true. This is so that when we're in an in-between state and the values are displayed to the user and we click a button, like the continue button or something like that to make the action continue, that will trigger a post. And as part of that post, we set this value to true, meaning we can use it later to check if the action has completed or not, or if we're waiting for additional steps from the action. Should also make preprocess return a request object here. And the post method here should not return an optional empty. It should return an action completion result of complete. So we set the session key to true to indicate that the action has completed, as well as return an action result of complete. That should be it for the handler. We can now switch to the action and implement the logic here. First, we're going to get the session key using the session manager. We don't have access to the session manager here yet, so let's create a class variable for that. And then we also need to initialize it or get it from the configuration. So now we get the session key. If this session key is anything besides null, we know it's been set. So then what we do is we can use the session manager to essentially clear this session key. So we can remove the session key. And then we're going to return the authentication attributes. So the return here is an authentication action result that is a successful result, and with that we return the authentication attributes. So these are the attributes that we get from the authenticator, so from the authentication context basically. If the session key has not been set, we are in a state where we're waiting for the action to complete. So then we return the action result of pending result. Now with the handler implemented, the addition to the configuration to add the session manager, as well as the actual action implemented, we now need to add a template to this as well. I'm just going to add it to a separate directory here under resources. We named it index in the handler, so the name of this is going to be index.vm. You can paste in some HTML here. Actually, I need to change this. It needs to be action. Here's a very simplified template. It shows our integer value and the string value, as well as a continue button to finish the action itself. There's more details about this templating system in various other articles, as well as the product documentation. But this can be made much more advanced than what we are using here. Okay, I think that's all the bits and pieces we need for our example action here. It's time to build the action using mvn package like we looked at in part 1. And then we need to copy the jar for this action into the USR share plugins directory that we created also in part 1. Since this uses a template, we actually need to copy this template file as well. So I'm going to start with making a directory in USR share templates and overrides. We need an authentication action folder in here. Oh, that didn't work. I first need to create this folder, and then we'll create the my example action subfolder. This is where we need to copy the index.vm file to. And with that in place, we can start the Curity identity server. If we switch to the admin UI, the demo action is still in effect here for my authenticator. It still has the same values as we looked at in part 1. And as usual, we're going to use OAuth tools to test this out. Initiate a code flow, and I'm going to log in with my authenticator. And here, the template that we have in place is displayed, and it's showing the integer and string value, and as well as the continue button. And when I click continue, the action finishes. So the first step of that's showing the information, is running the get method to present the values. And when we hit continue, a post is triggered, and the post clears the session and wraps up and finishes the action itself. And with that, we conclude the second part of how to develop a plugin using the Curity SDK.